International Cultic Studies Association, helping people since 1979. About ICSA. Founded in 1979, the International Cultic Studies Association, or ICSA, is a global network of people concerned about psychological manipulation and abuse in cultic and other high-control environments. ICSA is tax-exempt, supports civil liberties, and is not affiliated with any religious or commercial organizations. Our mission. ICSA provides information, education, and help to those affected by or interested in cultic and other high-control groups and relationships. Join or donate today at icsahome.com/membership. Disclaimer. Views expressed on ICSA websites or in ICSA's publications or events are those of the document's author or speaker and are not necessarily shared, endorsed, or recommended by ICSA or any of its directors, staff, or advisors. Reverend Kenneth Garrett is a senior pastor of Grace Church in Portland, Oregon. For 12 years, Ken and his wife Sharon belonged to an abusive, controlling church in which their life choices, beliefs, and behaviors were increasingly brought under the control of the church leaders. Ken and Sharon left the church in 1996 with their 3 daughters. Ken attended seminary and has completed postgraduate research in spiritual abuse as it occurs in Christian churches. Ken and Sharon now enjoy many opportunities to counsel and care for survivors of abusive churches from the Portland metro area and have established the Spiritual Abuse Forum for Education, or SAFE, a regular gathering to promote friendship and education for survivors of spiritual abuse. Ken is the author of In the House of Friends, Understanding and Healing from Spiritual Abuse in the Christian Church, and is a contributing author of Wounded Faith, Understanding and Healing from Spiritual Abuse.
Well, Ken, I am really looking forward to this interview with you. I was asked at just a couple of days ago to facilitate this interview because unfortunately, Neil Damgard, who was originally scheduled for this, had to make a quick trip to the ER and has some heart issues that he's wrestling with, and was asked if I could fill in. So I'm glad to pitch hit for him. And boy, there is a lot of material to talk about today, and I am really looking forward to hearing more about what drove your particular chapter in this book, Wounded Faith, Understanding and Healing from Spiritual Abuse. And maybe to start things off, you might share with those that are here today, in the first sentence of your particular chapter that we're speaking of today, and you have 2 chapters actually in this book, but the particular one is chapter 2, When the Walking Wounded Walk into Church, starting from page 11 of chapter 2 of this book. But in the first sentence of the chapter, you make this statement: the members of healthy churches often have a tough time understanding the concept of an abusive Christian church, a church that holds to correct Orthodox theology, perhaps, and yet functions like a cult. Why is it that why would you suggest that is an important point to make? And secondly, part B, why did you lead the chapter with that point?
Right. Thank you, Patrick. And before I answer that, let me just thank everybody who your names and pictures and faces I see there. Thank you so much for joining us, for giving up your Saturday morning to listen to Pat and I muse and talk, and that means something to us, and I appreciate you being here. Thank you. Okay, so why did I say that, and why did I stick it in this particular chapter? I said it, I wrote it because the Christian church as a whole, and I'm kind of skating on thin ice speaking for 350,000 churches in America, but the strain of Christianity that I came from really dropped the ball in understanding cultic studies and the significance of cults. And it started back in the 1960s, maybe 50s and 60s, when Eastern religious groups and cults began to infiltrate Western culture in America. And especially in Portland, it was pretty prominent. We're the home of Bhagwan Rajneesh and all of that. So, I mean, just for instance, so the response of the church was to find a way through a theological grid to explain to the members what a cult is and why we aren't a cult, which soon became why a Christian can never be in a cult if he's a Christian, and why a church can't be a cult, as strange as that sounds to us now. And the way that developed was through a theological approach of determining that something that all cults had in common, according to their studies, was a perversion or failure in the doctrine of Christ. Who is Jesus? Was he God? Was he man? Is he both? And those questions, which drove the great theological councils of years past, nonetheless, those became the determiners of what a cult was today. So as a result, evangelical churches especially began to teach that a cult is somebody with a defective Christology, an effective view of Christ. Well, every cult, I mean, any Christian cult has a statement of faith that usually squares up with a good, healthy church statement of faith. So it set a trap for people to where narcissistic leaders and absolute cultic individuals and groups could function under the guise of being healthy Orthodox Christian churches, telling their members, don't worry, folks, this may look like we're controlling your lives, but we're sure not, because we can't be a cult. This is actually good for you. And so that is what I cut my teeth on. And it and so that was completely wrong, because as I understand it, and I don't even use the word cult as much as I used to at all, as I understand it, the word cult and the concept of it is a description of a social construct that could be anywhere. It could be in a church, it could be in a synagogue, it could be in an AA meeting. It is usually a narcissistic leader who is exercising his twistedness or his dysfunction to extract need meeting from a group of people. That certainly can happen in a group, and it happened in the group I was in. And then the second part of your question, why did I lead this chapter with it? That issue is really fundamental for churches and pastors, and I mean healthy churches and healthy pastors, as healthy as a pastor can be. I try, but that issue is fundamental for us to understand if we are going to have anything to say to the survivor of a cultic Christian church, and that past defective thinking really set me up, and my wife Sharon. It set us up for being recruited into such an unhealthy and certainly cultic Christian church, because of feeling like we certainly couldn't be in a church because of the things we believed about Jesus. So I felt that that was so critical as a jumping off point to help people in churches assist and be sensitive and kind to survivors of cultic churches, but also for the cult survivor to reassure her that, yeah, it's okay to understand your experience as being a cult survivor, and you belong now in that whole world of recovery, both Christian and non-Christian and therapeutic and all of that. You belong in that world of finding your health, understanding that you were assaulted within your Christian church, and yeah, it counts for you. You were in a cult.
Wow. Well, and I think that really is a point well taken, Ken. And as I read through your chapter again the other day, I was reminded about how important it is in talking with those that have experienced religious abuse within a church context, to be told, and I think this is part of what you were communicating in that first sentence, and that is that you are not crazy.
Yeah.
And this is not an abnormal sort of thing to have experienced. Both, and I know I've read your book very carefully a couple times in the House of Friends, and it certainly parallels similar kind of experiences to what Heidi and I have had within the Christian church as well, early on in our histories, way back in the 80s, early 90s, and before, back in the 70s, actually, that a good doctoral statement, what we might term orthodox, is no guarantee that it's going to be applied in a healthy sort of way. And as a consequence, there really is a need to look at not only the belief system, but the behavior system. Kind of have a bifocal lens, as it were.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think you really start that chapter off well, and I really strongly commend to those that are attending here the importance of reading that particular chapter in the book. Kind of associated with these first A and B questions, why did you write this particular chapter in this book? And it kind of overlaps. You've answered that some already. Maybe you can unpack that a little bit more for us, if you would.
I felt, and again, I'm speaking probably for lots of churches that I may not have the right to speak for, but I felt, and after 20 years as a pastor, I know I've observed a generalized ignorance in otherwise healthy churches and very devoted and loving pastors. Nonetheless, a palpable deficiency of understanding spiritual abuse. And unfortunately, that results in people, when they kind of stir up their courage after their woundedness and say, okay, I was burned, that was wrong, but I still believe, I'm still a Christian, and I want to find a healthy church, and good grief, maybe even find some healing. So they start looking around for some place. And my experience is it's very hard for them to find a place where their personal baggage that they carry with them is understood. So they might say something like this when they ask, well, when they get down to saying, well, why they're there, or if people say, well, where do you come from? Or you grow up around here? And, just the normal kind of get to know you questions. They usually will throw out a little statement. It might be something about disagreements with the pastor, or getting in trouble with the church for something, or uncomfortable with this or that in the church's ministry. And usually that indicates their departure from that church was not done as I believe it should be done, with blessing and kindness, and saying, hey, you're moving on, and that's part of life, and God bless you where you go. Stay in touch. You're kind of always family to me. So love to see you again sometime. You just kind of you send people on their way with the hope of blessing and kindness. You sense that they didn't leave their church with that, and something is hurting there. Now, our normal, superficial that we all struggle with, it kicks in, and we just go, "Oh, that's too bad." you know, Here's a cup of church coffee and a cookie. And we kind of gloss over things. I found that in most churches, and in my own interactions, it's a real temptation to do that. But if you really listen to what people are saying, they are often giving you the indicators that things really went south in their church, and they were hurt very deeply, and that their pastor, usually it's their pastor, regardless of disagreements or anything like that, he certainly didn't treat them with the kind of graciousness and professionalism that a pastor should have. They were sent out the door packing. And when you begin to sense those things, here's getting back, I think, to your question. We have historically lacked the vocabulary to help these people.
Yeah.
We haven't had the words to say. We haven't known what to say. I mean, good grief, someone comes into the church and says, I'm diagnosed with cancer. We at least know to start saying things like, wow, what's your treatment going to be? How, are you eating?
Yeah.
And how can we help you through that journey? Because there's a vocabulary and an understanding of the core problem that the person is battling. But when it comes to spiritual abuse in Christian churches, because it lacked that kind of vocabulary, and I feel it continues to be woefully inadequate and I don't know, misunderstood in many churches for a few reasons that I can see. I believe that this chapter was needed to equip members in the church to help people and understand the devastation that they've been through.
Tell me, thinking back to your own experience of when you came out of a very abusive form of Christianity,
Yeah.
and particular church that you did, looking back, what might you suggest for those that are here attending this webinar as to a good response and perhaps a not so helpful response to when a church leader or just a church member asks them, well, what church have you been attending recently? Where have you been attending? What have you been, what has your spiritual journey been like? How would you suggest to them that they handle that question?
Yeah.
So that they don't reveal too much, and yet they don't totally dodge the question.
Right. That is an excellent, very relevant question. The autonomy of a person in an abusive church has been stripped away to where they naturally might feel that they have to answer that question. If somebody comes up and goes, "Oh, what church were you in?" I probably would have been running for the door, actually, for a number of years after my abusive church experience. But their autonomy has been stripped away. So they might feel compelled to overshare. And it's not oversharing because it's inappropriate. It's oversharing because it's under compulsion. Yeah. It may be a friendly compulsion. It might be a really sweet person that wants your friendship. And, that's the path to friendship, vulnerability and sharing. But it's not right for you. And so the advice I would give would be maybe to pre-think it a little bit and think through your answers so that you don't, run to the door screaming. It might be something like, it was just kind of a tough experience for me, and I'm not quite ready to go there, but it's
Yeah.
probably a 2 or 3 cup of coffee conversation that in the future, I think we can have it, but right now I'm not quite ready to go there. Now, I know that might sound flaky, and it might sound, especially coming out of a cult, words might fly to you like, you're being unteachable, you're being invulnerable, you're not sharing your soul, you're not contributing to the community.
Yeah.
All of those bats from hell basically fly at you. But I just want to reassure you, as a pastor who talks with many people like this, that it is a mark of healthy healing to
Yeah.
define what you'll share and what you won't share. There have been people, women that I've met, women and men, but women especially that I've met in the ministries who had been sexually abused by their narcissistic pastor, which is a horrendous crime against God and community and life, and wrong in so many ways. I don't want her to come to talk to me and then go right into that, because there's almost no way that that can be a healthy, beneficial thing to talk to a stranger and a man that you don't know who's a pastor about.
Yeah.
And so I find it encouraging to see a person advocating for themselves in that way by begging off answering the question, which I ain't going to ask it, but
Mhm.
to just say something like that of, you know what, down the road, that's going to be a cup of coffee conversation. And thank you for
Mhm.
asking. And you're going to be my first cup of coffee to talk about it. Thank you, but I'm not quite there. That's cool.
Yeah, and I think that's really a good point. Saying that's an important conversation, perhaps left for another time.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, a short kind of response,
yeah,
not so much a dodge, but just as a delay
yeah.
and as a way of setting a boundary and suggesting that there's going to be pace, that they value pace in sharing their story, because otherwise, I don't know about you, but I recall when both Heidi and I came out of groups that we were in way back, uh, churches, and then walked into a reasonably healthy church, and we shared part of our story. I recall, particularly, I was very guilty of this, sharing way too much. And then the response was very commonly, well, thank God that's all over, which is like, oh no, you don't understand. No, this is just
Yeah.
crazy. And it's not helpful really to anybody when a former member gets a response like that. It's like,
No.
on the inside of you, you're thinking, you don't have a clue.
Yeah.
And I think it's best I leave this place. Thank you, but no thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's a good reason to
Hmm.
respond in the way that you suggest. One of the other things we always suggested that people that Heidi and I work with, and we've worked with a lot of folks over the years, is that whatever you do when you walk into a church, make a point of keeping yourself safe. Part of that is sit toward the back of the church and certainly on an aisle row. So if you get overly triggered, you have
Yeah.
an easy
Yeah.
out, that you don't
Yeah.
feel as trapped.
Hmm. Hmm. Pat, that's a great point. When we left our church in 96, of course we were bouncing around and trying to just find a place to fit. And we ended up going to a church plant. That's a new church that they're just getting going. And it met in a college break room nearby in town here. And the pastor and everybody in it, they were just really sweet people. They were so kind. But they really had caught that idea that you don't rush people into levels of sharing and intimacy that they're not ready for. And
Yeah.
so what he had was in the back of the room, this dark area where and like all church plants, it had blazing spotlights on everybody. Not this one. In the very back of the room, it was dark, and you could sit back there with all of the teenagers making out But you could sit back there and be left alone and be anonymous and just hear. What I wanted was to hear encouraging teaching and preaching. I wanted to participate in music that was pleasant and I don't know. I just wanted to go because I wanted the community, and I also was a Christian. But I was allowed that anonymity, and I asked him about it later because I was kind of saying, I kind of like sitting in the back in the dark. And he said, yeah, we know a lot of people come in here that are not really wanting to get up there elbow to elbow with people that are worshiping and all that. They want to sit back and just observe, and we want to make that easy for them. And I appreciated that so much, and I try to accomplish that today in our services. People sitting in the balcony or in the back, we don't rush up to them and try to get their email and their name and all of that. We're just glad to see them, hope we see them again, and allow them to choose their level of recognition and that. So good point, Pat. I'm totally there. Yeah.
Well, good. Well, we are at the half-hour mark, and now might be a good time to, I've got several additional questions, but I would love to hear from those attending this webinar what questions you all have. So Nava, I'll turn this back over to you to kind of share some of those questions. And as we have silence in questions that are coming, I've got plenty of other ones here that I can interject, but I would love to hear from those that are attending here.
And I'm just reminding everybody to ask your questions in the chat so that we can use the recording. So if anybody has a question, just put it in the chat and I'll ask it as soon as it comes up. But Pat, you might want to just go ahead and start off with one of your questions and then we can go from there.
Okay. How, speaking directly to the chapter that you contributed, Ken, what would you suggest? How does this chapter fit with the larger flow of the book as a whole?
Yeah, thank you. When I finished the book, which was a big, long doctoral dissertation at the end of my studies, too long, too many words, and it just was really not a great job. Anyway, as I was finishing it, it might have been Michael Langoni and probably a couple of other friends who, reading it over, told me, you really haven't said enough about recovery from spiritual abuse. And my reason for that, really ultimately, because I hadn't thought enough about it, even though I was an abuse survivor. But I also felt like that was the realm of professionally trained therapists and the people that, were in practice like yourself, Pat. And I thought, yeah, it would almost be malpractice for me to speak into such important things authoritatively. But I thought more about it, and I thought, the purpose that I'm looking at here is to say what I think and what I've studied and to just kind of throw it out there. So, Ken, take a risk here. That made me think more and think more creatively about ways that I could easily communicate with a spiritual abuse survivor about those first steps of healing. And that's what I felt that chapter, how it would fit into the Wounded Faith book and I'm glad it's in the beginning of the book, because I feel like it's very important to address the immediate experience of a survivor of spiritual abuse who still might find themselves checking out a church, even though they might not go back, but they haven't given up on it. There's something there that they want. And I felt it was really important as a starting point to assure them that recovery did not involve quitting your faith or a lifelong battle that you know, if you're not ready to put on your armor and go to war against bad churches, just give it all up, which is a very big pitfall of recovery. I wanted to begin to present a view of healthiness. And that's why I started out with trying to acknowledge and really see the experience of those very people that are making their way back into a church, and they may look okay on the outside. Like, I think I probably looked fine on the outside with my wife and 3 daughters coming into the church and looking at how their youth group was and all of this. But man, on the inside, I was absolutely falling apart and having anxiety. Well, I suppose it's kind of an anxiety attack when you have to leave a service in the middle of it, which I did. But having so much anxiety, it was hard to even listen to or participate in the service because just being back was so difficult. And I wrote that chapter because I wanted to, from the very start of this process of recovery, acknowledge the experience and present it graphically for what a person is carrying into that church experience in the Monday through Saturday life.
Well, good. Thank you.
I have a question from the chat, and it says, what can we do to encourage seminaries to more adequately address spiritually abusive characteristics, including screening out those seminary candidates who show personality signs of being at least potentially spiritually abusive?
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I've had this conversation with my friends who are now professors in seminary, and I went to seminary with them, and we've talked about this. And the answer, I've got a good part of the answer and a bad part. The good part of the answer is, what can we do? It's to train meticulously the seminarian who is going into the pastorate, to train him to recognize narcissistic attributes in people, but especially in leaders. And I'll even go as far to say fellow leaders. And the reason I say that is that no narcissist is ever interested in studying narcissism. So you're not really going to get anywhere of saying, you know, you might be a narcissist. Let's see if we can change you. Narcissism in its classic form, as diagnosed and whatnot, this is serious stuff. And these are very highly dysfunctional, really screwed up people with an amazing skill set that is probably going to make it through seminary just fine, and maybe even on the strength of their skills and sets, get a position in a church. And I can't see a way around that except training people in seminary and churches, if you're able, training them to recognize what is narcissism and narcissistic abuse in the church, and what is just the humble and gentle leadership that we would expect from a pastor, of kindness and all of that. So the first thing is through education, not examination. Examination would be the idea of a seminary weeding out the narcissistic student. Almost impossible. Seminaries do not have the human power to do that. The best seminary professor, maybe he's the director of counseling department or something. I mean, even the best one has a very limited exposure to the student body. And the pastoral departments are into getting pastors that will study the Bible, spend time with God and praying and all of that. And anybody can fake their way through that for a seminary course. And so seminaries are sometimes unfairly tasked with the burden of weeding out or controlling narcissistic leaders. They don't have the ability to do that. They're a business, and they're a good business. I like their business. I mean, I paid my money and they gave me what I wanted, training and all of that. But they don't have the insight and conviction, and oftentimes even the understanding that enables them to see a narcissistic student and then somehow concoct the legal right to kick that student out of seminary. So that's the difficulty of it. And I don't think the seminary system, as I see it today, is really equipped to weed out the narcissists. They usually end up either meeting them later in court or apologizing for them later when they get in trouble.
Well, I think that's really a good point. I think I would suggest there are perhaps a few seminaries that, because they have a counseling program, that they may require their prospective students to go through a battery of psychological testing. And in those situations, for instance, I recall when I went through Gordon Conwell Seminary up in Boston, I was in North Carolina branch. I had to go through a battery of 6 or 7 psychological assessments. But that was primarily because I was looking to go into the counseling field, whereas an awful lot of seminary students are not looking specifically for that, and as a consequence, don't have that kind of testing that is done in process. I think, there's, I guess, to not really defend seminaries, because I think I certainly concur with you, Ken, that by and large, they are not well equipped. They are not, certainly do not understand religious abuse well, and really should ideally have classes on the topic, addressing it directly. I think probably the only book that I've come across recently that does a little bit of that, written by a seminary president, is a book called Bully Pulpit. Yeah. Bully, B-U-L-L-Y, Bully Pulpit, P-U-L-P-I-T. And I think he really, as both a professor and as a president, Michael Kruger, actually does directly address this topic. But I think he's the exception to the rule, absolutely the exception. I've not seen another book out quite like this, where he really tags it. He understands narcissistic abuse. He understands narcissism within the church and within within seminaries. But it is, that is far and away the exception to the rule. You just don't find it.
Just real briefly, thank you, Pat. I agree with that, and he's done some wonderful work. I've read a little bit of his book, and I'm diving into it because I'm going to be on a telecast where he's on it, and I want to hear what he has to say.
Wow.
My point in making that is, for instance, in my situation, my seminary had empowered 2 leaders, one a professor who was sexually involved with staff and then a student, and the other was a pastor who had fallen from his ministry, international significant pastor who left in the years past. And my seminary had very intimate relationships with both of these narcissists. And when the bottom fell out, as it always does, the seminary, my own perception was that they had failed miserably from owning the fact that they actually were empowering agents in those abusers. Mm-hmm. And they wouldn't step back and say, whoa, we got something to learn here, because we were pushing this guy's classes, we were giving him raises, we were doing anything to keep him with us because the people loved him so much. And they, as of this date, they still have not, with humility and honesty, admitted what they did that hurt so many people. And I feel that that's a tragedy and a mark of our seminary and its counseling department. One of its chief professors actually planted a church with the professor that this happened to. So a gentle pushback, Pat, is I would just say, as you know, these narcissists are cunning wolves that are so sharp, I think they can snake their way through a lot of testing. just my suspicion, and I leave it with you. You've studied it more than I, but
well, and I think your point is well taken. In my one example that I gave is strictly that one example of one seminary of one
okay,
because admittedly, I could, like you, point to other seminaries that absolutely positively do. They're so dysfunctional in their relational system that they certainly promote in a how do I put this, in a way that is very subtle, nowhere near as overt as dysfunction that you find in groups like Waco or anything like that. They're much more inclined to kind of sneak past the grid of counter cult people, of being able to tag them.
Yeah.
And certainly I would say from my experience in the field, probably we're talking about at least 90% of the seminaries out there, and perhaps more.
Yeah. Kind of clueless.
Yeah. Okay, we got some more questions here.
Yeah.
We do. Our next question is, how do you suggest to respond when the inference is made that leaving a church means you are not under a covering? Run for the hills from that person or community, say something. I find that this has come up from friendly, well-meaning Christians and especially leaders. It comes up especially because I'm a single female. I want a healthy community and mentors. I do not want to be controlled, used, and have my identity in life further eroded.
Of course. The covering thing to me has been so tragically abused that I simply would never speak those words to a man or a woman. It has been used to support a fiercely patriarchal system that the pastors and abusers interpose themselves in positions of authority over children, women, fellow men, and so it's not a good concept, and I don't believe it holds any water to me, simply because abuse occurring is abuse. There's no excuse about covering that should stop an abused person from escaping the abuse. So that idea of you're out from under the covering is frankly baloney, because when a person, and I'm speaking as a Christian, I don't want to assume my friends here in this are all on the same sheet with me about that, but I'm assuming that when I believed on Christ through no big effort of my own, but when I trusted him, I received a type of metaphorical mark on me. It's called the seal of the Spirit. I received something from him as a gift that set me apart in his thinking and provided something that I can't imagine the word covering can even come close to. So my confidence of my identity rests in that thing that happened. And that also entails me having an obligation to escape abuse and mistreatment. So run for the hills, engage in talk or whatever. It really depends on your situation. If you're in a ministry and you have any degree of leadership, if you're leading people, you're a small group leader, children's leader, teacher, whatever, wherever you fit into it, maybe you're on the council, the elder team, however your church rolls, I feel it's a good idea to communicate, you know what, this isn't right for me anymore. I'm not comfortable with this, and this, and we're going to back off. Now, if they have a problem with you backing off, you're in a cult. That's what I've told people from the local college cult in Portland here when they've said, I don't know if I'm in a cult or not, Pastor Ken, what should I do? I've said, go back and tell them you're going to take 30 days to just pray and think about it. Yeah. And you'll know immediately if you're in a cult or not. And the 30 days, of course, they can't let a person say that. They can't let a person claim God would talk to them or that they had a brain to think on their own. So it becomes quite evident. But I still think if you are of that kind of stature in your fellowship, you should communicate with the church just to say, we're going to take a little break, so please don't contact us.
Yeah.
Whether we come back or not, that'll be between us and God. But we really don't want emails. We don't want love gifts. We don't want people checking in on us. We'll let you know. Now, if you are abused in a way that is humiliating, degrading, or perhaps in a system where communicating would put you in front of a table full of men who are all judging you and speaking to you from a position of power and authority, and it ain't comfortable for you and you don't want to do it, forget about it, man.
Mhm.
You walk out the door
Yeah.
and find some friends that can relate and understand, and begin your healing process. So
Yes.
I definitely do not suggest to abuse victims of, hey, to be a good spiritual abuse victim, you ought to talk to your small group leader, you ought to talk to the pastor, you ought to write a letter, you ought to ask them permission to leave the church. Ha! No, you don't let the door hit you on your way out, and you
Yeah.
need to get away from that place.
I think you make a really good point here, Ken. Sometimes Heidi and I have suggested a line from a song by Kenny Rogers. You have to know when to hold them. You have to know when to fold them. You
Yeah.
have to know when to walk away, and you have to know when to run. And I think that's the same is absolutely true when you come into a church with a lot of hierarchy,
Yeah.
male hierarchy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Nah, that's just kind of a formula for disaster,
Yeah.
for pain and suffering.
Yeah. Danger,
And
Will Robinson, man. Danger,
yeah,
danger, danger. When you have a gender battle to fight, to simply be the kind of free and healthy human being that you were created to be, but you've got to
yeah,
get through a gender thing. Danger. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah.
Good.
Our next question says, Ken, thank you so much for your work in this field. My questions. It seems so much of evangelical and or some orthodox forms of Christianity. How do you within this belief system that stresses belief over actions, because Christ on the cross supposedly supersedes all human activity and everything is forgiven, because everything is excused and forgiven, then this behavior of the pastor and priest doesn't seem to matter within a problematic belief system. The belief system itself can encourage cultic abuse. How might you address this within your sphere of influence?
Yeah, the way I address it, that's a wonderful question, and I believe it's rooted in a theological error. And the error is that you are somehow relieved of the burden of obedience as a loving response to Christ. In other words, Jesus died for your sins. That means you're not going to hell. So therefore, go ahead and raise hell. I mean, you're clear. You got your ticket punched. And I want to say something. I do believe that in terms of security in Christ. But to fail to obey the scriptures and to love everybody and treat everybody with graciousness and respect, to fail in those regards gives evidence of the dysfunction and
Mhm.
tragedy of the current state of your relationship with Christ. So whatever's going on between you and the Lord is between you and the Lord. All I can say, Mr. Abuser, is that I see no evidence that you have ever met him. Maybe you have. That's between you and him. So I feel that the wrong idea, some people have called it antinomianism, the idea of behavior doesn't matter. It does matter,
Yeah.
because most all of the New Testament is written with a great regard for how we are socially functioning in our world. You can't disagree or disregard that. So my group excused all of the sins, of everybody, or especially of the pastor. by emphasizing how he was just like us, a sinner like us, had problems, and we all have problems, but in the end, we're all going to be okay. Well, we're not all going to be okay. We might make it in through fire and smoke, or we might be welcomed with open arms and acclaim. The Bible does not give us a pass to not obey it as Christians. So I see the theological errors being behind that, and a church that allows that, and especially allows it to excuse the behavior of an abusive leader, is one that you most definitely should leave immediately.
Yeah.
Immediately, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Our next question says, I felt that the group I was a part of wasn't bad enough after I left to warrant naming my experience as spiritual abuse for over 10 years. Now exploring spiritual community again, I still struggle with thinking this depending on who I'm talking to. Do you have thoughts to offer on what validates bad enough to explain myself, perhaps even if the explanation is in response to my own triggers I'm navigating? It's almost as if my experience really played on my subjective vulnerability of childhood emotional neglect, but it's hard to point to all the things that didn't happen.
Yeah, yeah. That is certainly a valid response. And I struggled through it. I think Sharon and I both struggled through it for a number of years after leaving our group. I did not call it a cult for about 10 years after leaving it. I just couldn't get my brain around it. And so that was my experience. Now, in terms of wondering if your group or your experience was really as bad as you thought, a couple of things I would say about that. The first thing would be that it is completely permissible and a wonderful approach to name those memories and feelings and think through them. And if you've got a friend or a therapist or whoever you talk to about this stuff, to ask them, was it wrong for me to get really uptight when they wanted to build an extra room onto the church, and I thought that they shouldn't, but they said they should, but they asked for money? Were they a cult? And the person might say, well, I don't know, what do you think? And you say, well, I don't really think so. I just felt like it was the way they asked. And you can start engaging and determining that. And it's really okay to process through those things. And besides that, as you process them, in the discussion itself, guarded and safely entrusted to people you can trust and friends, you have the very opportunity of discovering the good things about Christian fellowship, sharing your heart, sharing your brokenness, your questions. Was I in a cult or wasn't I? What do you think? And so you kind of have an opportunity to build some closeness there with people through working through the issue. So I wouldn't rush to the diagnostic. Was I in a cult or wasn't I in a cult?
Yeah.
You might instead say something like, I was in a group that at the very least was unhealthy. And as I think back to what I felt and what I shouldn't have felt, but I did feel, as I think back, the word cult also kind of flies in and out of my thinking. And I'm not sure about that, but I'm figuring it out now. But I definitely feel it was unhealthy, and I'm working through that. It's really okay to have that as an open-ended, lifelong thing that you're going through. Thanks.
That's a good point. Working through that process is incredibly telling with how a person's willing to go there with you. I think sometimes what Heidi and I have found, and you had mentioned how using the word cult is kind of a difficult thing for you, and you're doing that a little less than what you have in the past. One of the things that we've suggested to people that we've worked with is that in addition to the term cult, there's other terms that might be helpful to use. Sometimes a high intensity group or a high commitment group, or other times the acronym TACO, TACO, totalist, aberrant, Christian organization sometimes is another term that can help one better get their arms around what they experienced. Totalist meaning they really control an awful lot of the ideas. They want to control your feelings, your occupation, your relationships, your education.
Yeah.
Aberrant meaning they're off center. But the idea being is that it comes in a continuum. It's not either a cult or a non-cult, but there's a continuum here from extreme cult-like, for instance, like Waco or Jonestown, to a lesser extreme.
Yeah.
And there are many like that, a lesser extreme. Oh my goodness, there's an awful lot out there. But I think it's important to see things on a continuum, and that sometimes helps people get their arms around what they experienced without denying what they experienced.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. It kind of goes back to something I was thinking about that I mentioned earlier. The development of a healthy vocabulary about
Yes.
your
Yes. Yeah.
experience
Yeah. Good.
is paramount. In fact, what do therapists really do except communicate with powerful words, truth, and loving truth that helps you to understand what happened to you? So, developing those terms and acronyms, which could sound like jargons if you just kind of read through them, but one of them usually clicks and you go, okay, that's me. So yeah, developing the vocabulary, because somebody wrote on a comment that, you know, the covering concept sounds like Lifton's language manipulation within cults. And that is absolutely, as I see it, absolutely true. And it's very rare to me that somebody comes out of an abusive church, even if it has doctrines that everybody, Christians, agree on. Very rare that someone comes out of a spiritually abusive cult-like church and has not suffered under a diminishment of vocabulary and a control of language. So it's kind of getting your voice again to judge what was said, spoken, and written in your abuse. So it's a good thing to develop those thoughts in terms of the way you describe your experience.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you guys so much. We have one more question, and it's what should my expectation be for a community and a healthy church? I fear the intensity of connection has set us up for disappointment and frustration with what it feels like comparatively superficial relationships.
Yeah, I had such trouble finding intimate relationships, healthy intimate relationships with men and women, and with the church when I left, because the intensity of relationships in my cult was so powerful and so strong.
Yeah.
Not all evil. I have dear friends today that I hear from weekly or every day. Best friends. They've all left the cult, of course. But our relationships that were formed in the cult, maybe they've been redeemed, but also there are some very legitimate things. So I don't want to snub all of that.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, there are levels of intimacy and sharing that betray your conscience, betray your comfort level, and oftentimes betray marital intimacy, which, they're just secrets that husbands and wives have. And so I refer to Sharon as my partner in crime sometimes. We're not knocking off banks or anything, but just that she is able to hold information about me and me about her that I would die for. I simply would not betray, and she would not betray. And this is a healthy marriage. Of course, there can be unhealthy parts, but don't go there. It's healthy to have these kinds of heart sharing that are just between you two. Now, in a cult, that's all a mess. The only true intimacy that really is loved or accepted is between you and the cult leader, or ones that would have the approval of the cult leader. So when you leave and you venture into the world of establishing friendships, people at work, people in a new church, whatever, it feels like you're dealing with superficialities, because really you have been trained to only view a certain kind of interaction as legitimate and meaningful, and all other interactions as silly. That's why children don't get to talk about why they're in love with dinosaurs and why they want to dress like um, who's the space guy in Toy Story? Buzz Lightyear. Yeah, why they want to dress like Buzz Lightyear or Woody, or the things that are so precious to a kid. They don't get that in the cult. The only thing that's good language in the cult is God language, Bible language, always that adheres to the
Yeah.
teaching of the cult.
Yeah.
And so what I'm saying is that those conversations, like with the child, or just talking with a friend about a great concert that you went to, or why you like red wine and not white, or why you love this vacation and not another one, or something.
Mm-hmm.
These are conversations that build welcomeness and open the door to knowledge of each other and kindness and friendship. Those are healthy. But the cult has trained you to suspect those conversations as beneath you, because they're not ending with somebody meeting Jesus, and they're not ending with somebody coming to church. So when you first leave the church, the abusive church, as I was, you're kind of plagued with a certain kind of self-judgment that's unfair and simply wrong. You should enjoy having a cup of coffee with anybody and talking about the weather. That's normal and good and
Yeah.
human, and you should learn to revel in that. I in no way think that every time Jesus opened his mouth, a sermon came out and people left feeling bad about themselves or something. I think he probably sat down and talked about fishing, and hey boys, how's the fishing going today? And I just think he was probably a more lovable individual than we've often thought of him as being. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank
Good.
you so much for joining us, and thank you to all of our participants today. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording now. And yeah, thank you both so much. It was a great conversation.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for participating. If you're interested in continuing to support ICSA, please join or donate at icsahome.com/membership.